Henshall, Britain's leading expert on the events of 9/11, who was called by Tony as a witness today, but unfortunately didn't get into court. If you'd made it into court, what would you have told them, Ian?
Well, I'd have told them that the BBC was incompetent, verging on dishonest. Or let's rephrase that, dishonest. I was the leading author on 9/11 when they did their Conspiracy Files programmes. I never had a phone call from them. Now, you know, they might have disagreed with me, they might have disliked me, but as they're paid by the public to investigate impartially and give a full account of what happens, and if they're doing a film about so-called conspiracy theories, then that obliges them to talk to anybody who's, you know, in the position that I was. I'd been serialised in the Daily Mail. Instead, they got some guys from America who had some pretty kooky ideas and presented them to the public as the face of the 9/11 investigators, who they call conspiracy theorists.
You've published 2 books on 9/11, is that right?
Yeah, 9/11 Revealed, which was serialised in the Daily Mail and sold tens of thousands of copies, and 9/11 The New Evidence, which is the update on that book, which was a very detailed look into the paper trail, particularly of the 9/11 attacks and the role of the FBI and the CIA in facilitating the 9/11 attacks.
And yet the BBC had no interest in talking to you.
They had no interest in talking to me. They didn't even phone me up. They didn't email me. Even the people who made one of the propaganda films, Flight 93, they spent 3 hours talking to me. They didn't take a blind bit of notice of anything I said, but they did go to the trouble of phoning and talking. The BBC had a lot of resources. They don't want to know. They were grossly dishonest in their investigations of the 9/11 attacks, and that's what I was here to say to the court today.
Now, I'm right in saying, I think, that in the BBC's charter they are obliged to report in a fair and balanced way. Is that correct?
They are obliged to, and their failure to do that is absolutely stunning in the case of 9/11. I mean, you'll have probably heard how World Trade Center 7 building collapsed at free fall speed. They told the public it didn't collapse at free fall speed. The information came out it did collapse at free fall speed. They didn't tell the public. They told the public again and again throughout their programming that 9/11 has been investigated by the American authorities. 9/11 has not been investigated by the American authorities. If you read the 9/11 Commission report, which the BBC should have bothered to do, I doubt if they even bothered to do that. If you read that report, you'll find they did not ask the question who carried out the 9/11 attacks. They took it from day one as presumed that Al-Qaeda and the named hijackers carried out the 9/11 attacks. What happened? 9/11 was a grotesque circular argument. An hour before the World Trade Center towers had fallen, it was announced by the White House, by the American media, based on a source in the White House. They said, "We know who did this. It was Al-Qaeda." 1 hour after the planes hit the towers. That was announced, and nobody in the American establishment ever considered any other hypothesis from then on, and yet the BBC told its viewers again and again and again that the 9/11 attacks had been investigated by the American authorities.
This obviously has major implications, because the 9/11 attacks have been the reason for all sorts of legislation being brought in, resulting in loss of civil liberties, both here and in the United States and around the world, and the whole security apparatus, which some people say is now being turned on all sorts of other dissidents and
That's right.
the wider public.
Well, I mean, they call terrorism. I mean, if you have a row with your wife and throw a firebomb through her window, heaven forbid, that will now be called terrorism. So, you know, as always with state power, they get in a new power for one reason, and then they use it in lots of other circumstances as well. So it's not just terrorists, you know, who are at risk from the American legislative system. And recently we've had this horrific hit, and it does very much look like a professional hit against this ex-CIA guy who's been talking about 9/11.
Yeah.
I mean, by law, that could have been Obama who gave the order for that hit.
Yeah.
According to their own account, they now have the right to assassinate American citizens in America.
I know. It's extremely worrying.
It's very worrying. We can only hope that they run out of money.
They print more.
Yeah. Do you think this raises wider questions about the BBC's legitimacy?
It certainly does. I mean, the BBC has no moral standing currently. We now know that they were sheltering a child molester for decades.
And serial rapist.
Serial rapist, child molester, rapist, let's call it, whatever. But pretty much anything you could imagine, that guy seems to have been doing, Jimmy Savile. They knew about it at the BBC, they'd had complaints. And a very interesting quote came from Ken Clarke, who's a cabinet minister. He said, Jimmy Savile was a celebrated figure. All he was a DJ, he wasn't like the president of America or anything. He said Jimmy Savile was a public figure and no journalist or politician would have dared to take him on. Well, I think that tells you all you need to know about the system that we live under. Because if nobody's going to even dare to attack Jimmy Savile, who's just a DJ, then what chance have we got that anybody's going to attack the White House over the possible murder of 3,000 people?
Yeah. Thank you, Ian. That's a very good summary.
Okay,
thanks very much for your time.
Pleasure.